Good morning. Welcome to Genesis Church. We're so glad you're hanging out with us today. Another Lord's Day, another chance to gather for worship, although we're gathering again in our homes. And so we miss you. We are really looking forward to getting back together and praying that the Lord will let us do that soon. But we also want to make sure that as we pursue whatever that looks like, we do it in a safe way. And so hope these days are finding you well. Hope that you're hanging in there. I know that it's crazy and hard times, and if you're like me and like most of the people I'm talking to, we miss the fellowship of the faith. And so if you're part of Genesis, man, I can't wait to be with you. And if you're not, if you're just checking us out and visiting, we're glad you're hanging out with us this morning and participating in our Sunday service. Man, I hope you watched and enjoyed that last video we showed. Just thinking about people who've made it to 55 and 65 years of marriage. That is a crazy milestone, and what an amazing thing to be married that long. And as we read the scriptures and understand the Bible and understand God's purpose and plan for relationships, for who we are, He made us for community, and He made us for relationships, and marriage is one of these central relationships that we have on earth that God has given as a gift. And so to be married and be married that long is such a beautiful thing. And if you're a person who is married, that should be our goal, to be with our spouse and to do it long enough so that you literally are looking at each other's eyes well after 40, 50, 60 years. In fact, I heard a story this last week about a couple who'd been married 61 years. And sadly, they both passed away on the same day from COVID-19. But man, what a testimony of making it 61 years in marriage, of dealing with the same person, putting up with the same person. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. We're in a study of this amazing letter that this guy named Paul wrote to this church in the ancient world that is called 1 Corinthians. He wrote this letter to this church in the city of Corinth. More about that in a few minutes. And we're kind of jumping back. If you've been hanging out with us, we've been talking about the resurrection from chapter 15. And now we're kind of coming back. We had actually been doing a series for a while that was on this section, this middle section here in 1 Corinthians, where Paul interacts with the sexual ethic and some of the values of their culture at that time, and talks about marriage and the importance of marriage, but also has a lot to say to encourage the beauty and the wonder and the gift of people who are single. And Paul does a great service to the church by reminding us that there's something beautiful and rich about marriage. There's something beautiful and rich about people who are living as a single life, living as singles to the glory of God, and that we need both in the church. And the church needs to be a great place and a safe place for both. So we've been doing a series just talking about that when this pandemic hit, about God's design, God's plan, and what Paul has to say in this letter to this church who's in just a crazy culture. And most of the sermons in this series have been PG-13. This morning we realized that we got kids in the room with you, so we'll temper it down so that you don't have to worry about what we're going to say to them this morning. But we are going to be talking about God's design for marriage and some questions that Paul answers in this. I was thinking this week about this and got to thinking about the story of Lee and Leslie Strobel. If you're not familiar with Lee Strobel, he has written several great books defending the Christian faith, like The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith, The Case for a Creator. Lee's background is that he actually got a journalism degree at University of Missouri. He was an atheist, an agnostic atheist. Both he and his wife, when they were married, did not believe in Jesus at all. He moved to Chicago and became a journalist there with the Chicago Tribune in the city of Chicago. And while he was there, his wife had a neighbor in their apartment building come start talking to her and sharing the faith with her and taking her to church. And she became a follower of Jesus. And it actually really ticked Lee Strobel off. He was not happy about it. In fact, he said, I had married one Leslie, the fun Leslie, the carefree Leslie, the risk-taking Leslie, and now I feared she was going to turn into some sort of sexually repressed prude who would trade our upwardly mobile lifestyle for all-night prayer vigils and volunteer work in a grimy soup kitchen. And, he in his mind, he had married one person. Now she was becoming a different person. And this led him on a journey where he actually started exploring her faith, I think partly to actually destroy her faith. His goal was to kind of take a journalist look at the Bible and at the resurrection, the things that we've been talking about here at Genesis, in an attempt to debunk them, to show that her beliefs were fraudulent. But ultimately, that journey led him to believe in Jesus and to trust in Jesus. And it was the witness, the testimony, and then the faithful, just loving him that his wife brought to that relationship. They eventually wrote a good book that is, some of you might consider, called The Spiritual Mismatch in Marriage, that deals with what it looks like when one person believes, the other person does not, or one person's faith is really strong and growing and the other person is not in the same place. He ultimately said this. He said he was surprised by the changes he saw in his wife, and he wrote this in his book. He said, "I was pleasantly surprised, even fascinated by the fundamental changes in her character, her integrity, and her personal confidence." See, Lee Strobel saw the evidence of Christ in his wife Leslie's life when she became a follower of Jesus. And rather than stepping into that relationship and for her saying, I'm a follower of Jesus now, I can't be in this relationship, she stayed faithful to the marriage, faithful to what God had said to her, faithful to what we're actually going to read in our text today. And by doing so, became an influence where God actually redeemed and rescued her husband. And he's become one of the most important voices in the church in our current era, defending ideas that we as followers of Jesus believe. And they give us a great example of what Paul is going to talk to us about this morning. Like I said, we're studying this book called 1 Corinthians. It is a letter from Paul to this church in the city of Corinth. And the best way I can describe Corinth would be like it's a church that would be located on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. Corinth was a seaport. It was a city that had just all kinds of crazy practices. There was a lot of immorality, a lot of brokenness in the city, but there was also a lot of wealth. It had a very strong entertainment district and entertainment culture. It had a very strong arts culture, and it was just a place where it was a major metropolitan city. It was a seaport. The people who lived there were a mess. In the center of the city was this temple to the goddess Aphrodite, and it was just that, like, that's the goddess of love, and there were all kinds of things going on that, because kids are in the room, I'm not going to describe, but it was just a common thing for people in that city to be involved with multiple people, and it was just normal that even married people would go visit people and go visit prostitutes or be involved in relationships that were just not the things that God had created them for. And in the midst of this city, Paul visited, proclaimed Christ there, preached the gospel, and people came to believe in Jesus, and he planted this church. And Paul spent quite a bit of time there, discipling them, helping them grow, and helping them understand that they were now a culture, a city within the city, a culture within the culture. They were now people who had left allegiance to Rome and allegiance to the gods of the Roman Empire and the Greek system. And they were now, had been rescued and redeemed by Jesus. They had given their life to him. And because of the cross and because of the gospel, they were to be different people living in Corinth. They weren't to just abandon Corinth and leave. They were to live in Corinth, but live in Corinth as people who had a different God, a different king. And so if you read 1 Corinthians, he writes this letter after he planted this church and he had left them for a few years. And now he writes a letter back. And that letter, the cause for the letter is kind of twofold. First of all, some people had come to visit Paul and shared some of the things that were going on in Corinth. And there's a lot, like Corinth, the Corinthian church became a hot mess, because often when you see churches in any culture, what happens is that people will trust in Jesus, but boy, it's hard to get Corinth out of the people. And so they were still being influenced by the beliefs and the attitudes and the values and the mindset of the Corinthian culture. And so some people came and just shared with Paul the concerns of things that were kind of going on in the church. For example, they were fighting. There was all these divisions, and there was a huge cult of personality. And it was kind of like, even in our day, on Twitter, you have your people you follow, and man, you pick your side and somebody else picks their side. And we just can't even find common ground. And there was a lot of brokenness and division in the church. There was a lot of sexual immorality. In fact, it was happening even inside the church, where a guy was hanging out with his stepmom and bringing her to church with him. And that became a problem that they had to address. And there was a lot of brokenness. There were a lot of weird ideas about marriage. Some people were saying that marriages, like if you're married, but you become a believer in Jesus, you need to leave the marriage and just live a celibate life. Other people were saying, no, it doesn't matter. God forgives. You can live however you want to. Just call on Jesus and he will forgive you. And Paul's trying to correct those things. They end up with all kinds of other issues. They actually have people who are getting drunk when they take communion, which is funny and weird. They have crazy experiences with spiritual gifts. And we're going to be getting to all these things. But the middle section here, so kind of what happens in the Corinthian outline, the way, if you were to like study the book as a whole and see an outline, there's kind of a start, a finish, and a movement. Paul begins with the cross. He begins by explaining to them that they preached only the cross of Jesus Christ, and that the cross was sufficient for all things, that the cross is where we find forgiveness. The cross is where we find redemption, that Christ has given his life for us, and that when we turn from ourselves and we look to what Jesus did for us, that God himself has rescued or provided rescue and redemption. And Paul says, listen, that he boasts only in the cross, that he preaches only the cross, because only the cross has the power to rescue, to redeem, to change people. And so Paul starts with the cross. He then starts addressing the issues that he needs to address. And so he starts going through these issues, and kind of halfway through the book, he gets into these issues of sexuality, marriage, relationships, singleness, how the culture sees these issues, how the scriptures see these issues, and how the people of God are to be different because they trust in Jesus. But then in chapter 7, he stays in the same topic, but he starts the second half of the book. And what happens in the second half of the book is, apparently, while there were some people who came and reported to Paul some of the problems that were going on, the Corinthians also had composed a letter, or a section of the Corinthians had composed the letter and had just kind of written Paul all kinds of questions. And so chapter 7, verse 1, he literally begins with saying this. Now, let's get to the things that you asked me about, and starts wading through the questions. But he kind of starts where he left off with his challenges and even his rebukes to the Corinthian church. And he steps in and says, now, as we're going to answer questions, we're going to kind of stay in the same area. We're going to talk about marriage and sexuality. And the first 6 verses of 1 Corinthians 7 is actually written to married couples, dealing with what it looks like for them to be a married couple. And then what happened in our series, the very last sermon we preached before we had to take a break, is that Darren Slater, gets too many friends named Darren. Darren Slater helped us understand what this chapter 7, has a lot to say about people who are living as single people in the world, and how to live with contentment and hope, and to realize that Christ is enough. And so he preached on that. And then the virus hit. And so we took a few-week break from 1 Corinthians altogether and went to Habakkuk and dealt with what it looks like to live in a broken world, and just how to navigate that at this time. And then we jumped forward to 1 Corinthians 15, which dealt with this amazing, because the story, the book begins, the letter begins with the crucifixion, and it ends with the resurrection. And we talked about Jesus' resurrection and ours. But here's the point, that all these problems, all these issues, all these struggles that they're having as individuals, as a church as a whole, trying to figure out what it looks like to live for Jesus in their culture, listening to false teaching, all these things are sandwiched between the cross and the empty grave. That just like the disciples were living in between the cross and the empty grave from Friday to Sunday on the weekend that we celebrate as Easter, we too are living in this in-between time where Christ has redeemed us. The cross has been affected. It has been applied to our lives. If we're followers of Jesus, this is what's happened to us. But the empty grave and the resurrection is coming, and we live in this in-between time. And the goal and the purpose of our lives is to live filled with God's Spirit, empowered by his presence, experiencing the riches of his grace, to live as people who honor Christ, who are seeing our lives transformed by the beauty of the gospel, and who literally live out the implications of that good news in our lives. And so this is what this will ultimately mean, is that marriage, sexuality, and these things are a good gift for everybody. But it will look different for the people of God in the church, because we are now living out the truths of marriage and relationships in a way that seeks to honor Jesus, seeks to honor Christ, that seeks to live out what God has done in our life. And that's where this chapter takes us. What we're going to talk about today, kind of concluding this series with an 8-week break on marriage, sex, and relationships, or in singleness. We're going to conclude this by talking specifically about some of the questions that these people raise specifically about marriage. So hopefully you've already read the text from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 6 through 24. I'm not going to read it, although I'm going to read parts of it as we preach. I hope you've already read this. If not, go ahead and pause the video and read it now. But we're going to look at this as Paul literally is going to pick up a few questions. But he starts at verses 6 and 7. Check this out. Chapter 7, verses 6 and 7. Look at what he says. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. Now, here's what he's saying. He's saying, listen, Paul himself, he is single. He is a single man who has chosen to live as a single person for the glory of God, the cause of the gospel. He realizes, in fact, he's going to argue this later in this chapter, and this is what Darren preached on already. He's going to argue that for some people, being single may be a calling, because they may be choosing to go live their lives in hard places. They may be choosing to feel like their lives need to be more devoted to the purpose of Christ. And to be honest, family makes that hard sometimes. So Paul's saying, listen, I wish some of you honestly would see singleness as a calling so that you could go do missions and you could go live for the fame of Christ and you could give yourself away and that sort of thing. But he says that's not for everybody. That the biblical example is that some will be single, more will probably be married, that both are a good thing, both are a gift. And he says this phrase, look at it again. He says, I wish you were all as I myself am, but each has his own gift. Key word here, gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. In other words, here's what he's saying. He's saying, look at yourself like today. Look at your relationship, your life, who you are. You're like, are you married today? As you're watching this, do you have is there a spouse in the room? Are you single? Maybe you're watching this and you're your stories that you've been through divorce and your life has had some of the pain and emptiness that has been caused by that. Maybe you've gone through abandonment. Maybe you're in a marital relationship that is really hard. And you're seeking to follow Jesus, but your spouse is not really there, or there are other struggles in a relationship. And here's what Paul's trying to get across to us, that whatever state you are in right now for this moment, that is God's gift to you. Now that may seem crazy for some of you, and I totally understand that. I totally understand that to look at this and say, those of you who are single right now, this is God's gift to you. Those of you who are married, this is God's gift to you. And right now, some of you who are single are thinking, if I was just married, I'd rather have that gift. And some of you who are married are thinking, if I could just be single, I would rather have that gift. And some of you are looking around at your kids. In fact, one of the interesting things about this whole quarantine thing is that it's taken, this whole chapter, if you were to read the whole chapter and see the tension of the different challenges that you have, like single people have this set of challenges and this sort of struggles and these sort of things. And married people have these sort of challenges, these sort of struggles, these sort of things. And what happens is that this whole quarantine moment, all the things that have happened, one of the things that's going on is that all of the issues that Paul raises in the entire chapter are being run through a megaphone in our lives, are being amplified, because for those of you who are single, in fact, my heart breaks for some of you that there has been an isolation, a loneliness, just a feeling of being alone. And I know that's awful and tough. And I just want to tell you that we're praying for you. If we could help you, let us know. Don't be in this alone, even though there's a sense in which you are in your house sometimes alone. We've had our community groups going. I think that's a healthy thing. Seek relationship in ways that you can have it. We're praying that some of this stuff, we're seeing it starting to be lifted soon. And on one hand, we're wrestling with how do we do this well. On the other hand, we want to make sure that we keep people safe. But if for those of you who are single, I just know this has been a tough time. It's hard to hear what Paul's saying and saying, this is a gift. And some of you are literally looking over real sheepishly at your wife and your kids going, oh my gosh, if I have to spend one more day with these people, I'm going to blow a gasket. Like, I can't take it. I like at the Hubbard house, I'm just being honest with you. There are days where if it's raining or we just get cooped up inside because we're all busy and we've just been inside all day, by dinner time, we're done. Like, not just done, we're done with each other. All of a sudden, everybody's fighting, everybody's screaming, nobody's happy. And it's hard to take a step back and go, this is God's gift. That's what Paul says. Funny joke, right? It doesn't feel like a gift sometimes, but that's the key point of this entire text. Paul is saying that what God has given you in this moment is his gift. If you're single, for today, this is his gift. If you're married, for today, this is his gift. And there's two ways to wrestle with this. We could get too worried about how that speaks to our past, or too caught up in what that means for our future. And here's what I mean. Some of you, when I say like your current situation is God's gift, and you're like, but I've got failure. I've been through divorce. I have guilt and shame that come from mistakes I've made in this area. How do I see that as God's gift? And what I want to tell you is that as you look backwards, you need to know that the cross is sufficient, that Christ has covered your sin. He has dealt with your guilt. You don't have to feel the shame and anguish of your failures that are going backwards. And you don't have to hold on to that stuff anymore. You can know that Jesus has paid it all to him I own. Listen, my sin left me black and broken, but Christ's death on the cross has cleansed me of all sin, and that I am forgiven. But there's also a danger in the way so many of us live our Christian lives. The promise of forgiveness going backwards is a beautiful promise. That guarantee does not go forward. Now, yes, we will eventually, if you're a follower of Jesus, you will eventually be forgiven of all sin, past, present, and future. But hear me very closely. It is a dangerous, dangerous idea to look at my life and say, you know what? I know God says this about my relationships. I know God says this about how I'm to do sexuality and relationships with people. I know that God says this about the way I'm supposed to be obedient to him. But here's the deal. I don't really want to do that right now. And this is what I know. I know that if I go live my life the way I want to, if I go do the things that I want to do, if I kind of ignore God's commands and God's law and live my life the way I hope to live, eventually I'll come back to God and God will forgive me. And the scriptures have warning after warning after warning that we cannot, if we are truly following Jesus, that cannot be the posture of our heart. That is the path to disaster. That is the path to hardness, where we will start by saying, well, I'll come back to Jesus someday. And the next thing we know, 3 or 4 years later, our heart is cold and callous and dead. So here's what Paul's saying. He's saying today, you woke up this morning. What state are you in? That is God's gift to you. Trust in him with that. Honor him with that. And then he takes that principle and he applies it in this whole chapter. In fact, we're not dealing with the whole chapter, but he takes that one basic truth and applies it to every question and every issue that he can get to around the questions that they wrote him around marriage and around singleness and around what that means. And so for you, read the whole chapter, understand that this is where he's going. We're going to deal specifically with some of the questions that he gets about marriage in our text and kind of deal with that. And then we're going to come back to this principle at the end and just talk about how this idea of trusting in the Lord with today in my relationships is so key to just making it through life and for living for something that is fulfilling and beautiful, and even for taking the relationships that I have that are broken and filling them. And so let's first of all, I want to talk about a couple things. Our goal is to kind of wade through this and see how Paul answers some of these questions and then come back to this idea and just hopefully in doing that be an encouragement to you about some of the questions you might have, but also an encouragement to you from the scriptures of what it looks like just to live your life, married or single, but specifically today, some questions about marriage, to encourage you to live your life with God's purpose and his redemption, with the cross and the resurrection. And here we are in between, trying to honor Christ, hopefully. And as we do that, what does it look like for us to just walk with him? And so let's just deal with some of the questions that Paul answers. And the first one is written verses 8 and 9, where basically the question is, should I get married? Look what he says, verse 8 and 9. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So the first question is, all right, I'm widowed, I'm single. Should I get married? If I'm a single person, or if I've lost my spouse, or I think this on some levels even addresses those who've been divorced, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but should I get married? And Paul says, listen, I think it's fantastic if you can live as I am. He says, live as a single person. There are so many other things you can do, both for yourself and for the kingdom. Now, he warns in this chapter of a type of singleness that says, I'm going to be single so I can be selfish. And that's not what Paul's talking about. But he says, listen, there is a beauty to singleness. And like our church culture, we have to be a great culture where people who are single can have depth and beauty in relationships with people, can have community, can have a sense of connection without feeling like they have to get married. In fact, those of you who are married, let's just get rid of this in our vernacular and our talk. Let's stop looking at people who are single and start like acting like we need to hook them up and get them relationships, because that is just not honoring to God or to them. Okay? And so we need to be a culture that's safe, but the question is, should I get married? And Paul makes it really simple. He makes it really simple. He says, I wish a lot of you would be like I am, but here's the deal. If your desires, if your passions start burning, that is God's way of telling you that you should be preparing yourself for marriage. Now, this is so different from our culture, okay? Our culture is literally looking at you saying, if your passions burn, go fulfill them. If your passions burn, just go find somebody and spend a few days with them or spend a night with them. But Paul is saying, if your passions burn, here's what it ought to do. It ought to help you grow up, prepare yourself to be the type of person to be married, and then go find someone to marry. That's the basic premise here. That the desires that God has placed in us, that when those desires come alive, it is really a call to become men and women. One of the sad things about the way our culture is wired and kind of the hookup culture of our day is that we have, in many places, a generation, especially of young men who want all the freedom, but none of the responsibilities that intimacy were designed to give us. And it's created all kinds of issues. And God's desire, God has literally created us so that if that desire awakens, it is a call for us to become the type of men, the type of women that will honor Christ and will live in a healthy relationship, and then to begin to pursue that. Okay? And so, yes, some of you should be pursuing marriage. Some of you should be growing up. Some of you should be, if you're still living in your mom's basement and you're still playing video games all the time and that's your whole life, and you're looking at things on your computer that are not helpful for you, really, this should all be a sign to close that up, to get a job or to work hard and to develop yourself as the type of person that a woman would want to marry. Okay? And that may feel harsh, but I think that's exactly what Paul is getting at here. And so, yes, some should get married. Not everybody will. And God's design is that this part of our lives is created by God to lead us to this. Second question that gets asked is, what if I married the wrong person? What if I roll over and I wake up and I go, yeah, that dude, he is not right, or not me, but if ladies, or if guys, you roll over and you're just like, this is not the woman I thought I married, and all of a sudden you feel like you've married the wrong person. And the question here is of divorce, and he says this: to the married I give this charge, verse 10, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Now he starts by saying, I give you this. It's not I, but the Lord gives you this command. A little bit later, he's going to say, not the Lord, but I. And for a long time, I wondered, what is that all about? And it's not that complicated, but I thought, okay, is this verse more important than that verse? But I believe all scripture is inspired by God. So how do I deal with this? Well, literally, Paul is saying, in this first command in verses 10 and 11. He's going to get to a different issue starting in verse 12. But in verses 10 and 11, he's saying, listen, I'm just telling you exactly what Jesus said when he was on this earth. In fact, he's quoting the idea. He doesn't quote it word for word, but the idea that's in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, where Jesus is speaking, and he says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In other words, Jesus is being very clear that says, listen, unless there's been adultery in the relationship, divorce is not God's purpose and plan for you. And so he challenges them on this. And this is a simple thing to read. That, like, there's not a lot of wiggle room here and in the scriptures about what the Bible says about divorce. But I will tell you that it is also super complex to apply to our lives. It is super complex to try to work this out in individual people's lives and help them figure out what to do. Now, your church has done a couple things. This is one of the things I will encourage you. First of all, we actually have written a paper on this. And I don't have time in this sermon to unpack all the different attitudes and values and issues related to divorce and remarriage. I would encourage you that we've posted that paper in the blog post where you're watching these videos or where you found these videos. Go download that and just read that. And if you have questions, please come talk to me. The second thing I will tell you is that if you're a follower of Jesus and you're part of our church or any church, and you start having these struggles in marriage, for the love of God, don't do this alone. Don't just wake up one morning and go, I'm out, and leave. Don't just get discontent. Don't allow yourself to drift from God and from your spouse, and just all of a sudden at one point in time, you don't want to hear any counsel. Early in this process, come find help. Come pursue reconciliation. Come pursue peace. Come and let your elders, your community group, let people enter into this struggle with you. Don't do it alone. It is not God's best for you to leave your spouse. It is not God's best for you to separate. It is not God's best. And Jesus is clear, and Paul echoes this, that if you leave, you can't remarry. If you ditch your husband and go find somebody else, and this is where I was warning earlier, to look at this and go, all right, I'm going to leave because I want that guy or I want that girl, and I'm going to go do this. You're messing with fire of God allowing you, like giving you the desires of your heart. But as he gives you the desires of your heart will become calloused and cold and hard and distant. And you will begin revealing that you never really knew Christ. But listen, this is why we need each other. There are times in every marriage where the feelings wane and where the tension is high. And if we pull into ourselves and just get discontent, if we let our eye wander, if we don't have somebody who's holding us accountable, just saying, hey, are you loving your wife well? Like I got a group of men that are both here. Our elders do this really well for each other. And I've got friends in the ministry who, if I'm with them, every once in a while, they're going to look at me and go, hey, man, are you loving Heidi well? Are you dating your wife? Are you going to websites that aren't cool? Are you letting your eye drift? And I need the brotherhood and the sisterhood of the church to help me with this. Like, I have my wife, but it's hard sometimes, right? And just the challenge, listen, if you feel your heart drifting from your spouse, don't do it alone. Find somebody who can start navigating that with you. Be soft-hearted. Ask, just prayerfully over and over again, ask Christ to work on you, shape your heart, and change you. Because marriage is beautiful, but it's hard. And I will say, well, all of a sudden I'll say, well, I married the wrong person. So clarity here. There is no such thing as the right person. We look to marriage thinking I'm going to find somebody who will fulfill dreams and fill a void and whole. There's no such thing as the right person. We are sinners in need of grace. Marriage does not complete us. In fact, more than anything, here's what marriage is going to do for you. It is going to reveal how deeply you need the gospel, how deeply flawed you are, and how much you need Jesus and how much repentance, while at the same time giving you a human relationship that just keeps loving you anyway. And you now have a human relationship where they're going to be flawed, they're going to be broken, and you just keep loving them anyway. Duke University ethics professor Stanley Hauerwas said this: destructive to marriage is self-fulfillment ethic that assumes marriage and the family are primarily institutions of personal fulfillment, necessary for us to become whole or happy. The assumption is that there is someone just right for us to marry, and if we look closely enough, we will find the right person. The moral assumption overlooks a crucial aspect to marriage. It fails to appreciate the fact that we always marry the wrong person. We never know whom we marry. We just think we do. Or even if we first marry the right person and just give it a while, and he or she will change. For marriage being the enormous thing that it is, means that we are not the same person after we've entered it. Like literally the day you got married, the fact that you were married, you are now a different person. The primary challenge of marriage is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you find yourself married. That's marriage. That's truth. Listen, I did a calculation, and as of today, this is Heidi and I's 11,663rd anniversary day. We've been married 11,663 days, which means there have been 11,663 times I rolled over and she rolled over, and my breast stunk and her hair was a little sideways. And what happens every morning is on one level, it's the same woman. And on another level, every single one of those mornings, there's something a little bit different. We change. And the gospel moves us towards each other to hold on and to love each other, not because of who you are on any given day. Listen, let's be honest. Of those 11,000, 8 or 9, hopefully 1,000, 7,000 have been really good. There's a few thousand that have been tough and really bad. And in the midst of that, the gospel call is for me to realize that on one level, she is the wrong person and I'm the wrong person for her. On another level, she is God's gift to me, and God has given Heidi to me so that I can be loved and love someone the way Christ loves us. Where I am both the recipient and the giver of forgiveness. Where on some days, I need somebody to represent Jesus who will look at me when I am broken and say, I forgive you and I still love you. And on other days that I'm the one who looks and says, you are still smoking hot and I'm still crazy about you, and we're going to make it through this. And that's what marriage is. And so you're not going to have the right person, and divorce is not an option in the Christian plan. Now, there are some things, and I know that speaking of this, there are some of you who are in relationships that are harsh, that are broken, and God forbid, some of you who are dealing with the weight of abuse. Don't mishear me. In some situations, in fact, he even affirms it. He says to the wife, he says, if you do separate, wait. Don't go find somebody else to marry. But Paul even here affirms that there are times where, because of deep issues and challenges, the best option for a season may be separation. If you are in a relationship where there is abuse going on, where your spouse is being physical with you and using power to put you in your place, don't hear me saying suck it up and just stay there. Go get help. Come to your elders. Let's find a way. And there will be a season where it's really hard, but Christ is good. We want to help you find redemption. Paul is not saying stay in abusive relationships for the glory of God. He will put the weight of that on his church to deal with this and interact with this in a godly way. But God's plan ultimately is to see redemption brought in the relationship, and the way we do that is by honoring Christ and obeying him. And so if there is a season where separation, I think there's times where separation with the church being involved can be a helpful thing. But the goal is to seek Christ and hope that he can bring redemption, and to realize that even in those moments, he is shaping you. Third question that is raised in this text is, what if I'm married to an unbeliever? Verses 12 through 16. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord. In other words, Jesus didn't give this specific command, but it's still scripture and it's still the very word of God. I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother and sister or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you not know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you not know, husband, whether you will save your wife? In other words, sometimes there are relationships where, especially in this culture, you had Paul preaching in Corinth, and a lot of these people were not Christians. They were married, and they were involved in all kinds of practices and things like that. And then one of them became a follower of Jesus. What are they to do? Are they to leave that relationship? And Paul gives instruction that has been helpful throughout the church ages. It says this: listen, if you're married and you become a follower of Jesus, and your spouse is not a believer, stay. Don't leave. Just stay and be faithful. In fact, in 1 Peter 3, verses 1 and 2, Peter, echoing this, says this: likewise, wives, be subject to your own husband, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. And so the admonition, the obedience here is to stay, to be faithful to Christ, to make your home a place where you live out the implication of the gospel, even if your spouse doesn't. That by doing that, God will put his mantle blessing, or he will set your home apart for his glory. If that person leaves you, so kind of back to Lee Strobel, if let's say he left her because he didn't want her, like he married this girl, now she's this girl because of her faith, and he leaves, that in that case you are free to pursue other relationships down the road and things like that. But the goal is to stay together and to see Christ work. And he even says, listen, you never know. Just like Peter said, you never know that your conduct, your love, your faithfulness to that person won't be the very instrument that God uses to rescue and redeem your spouse. And so for those of you, I know some of you, you're in this situation. You may have gotten married and both of you were kind of following Jesus, but one is kind of separated from the faith and distance. Some of you weren't, neither one of you were followers of Jesus when you got married. And there's just a beautiful, clear admonition, direction here from the Word of God for you. And a blessing to realize that marriage as a covenantal relationship is something that God has given to all humanity. You don't have to be a follower of Jesus to enjoy it. And when there is a spiritual mismatch in that marriage, that there is grace and blessing when you honor Christ and stay in that relationship. And so that's what Paul says. Now, that's kind of his answering these questions that they raised. But in this, he also gives an ultimate hope. And this ultimate hope, there's a larger issue that kind of hovers over this, and that is that we are, like, as sinful, fallen people, we are wired to think that the brokenness and the struggle and the pain and the stuff that's going on inside of, if I just had this or if I just had that, we begin to pursue certain things in our lives thinking, if I just had those things, my life would be full. My life would be complete. This emptiness that I have on the inside of me would be undone. And so you see it in middle school girls who start thinking, if I can just get that boy to like me, I will matter. Or if I can just be popular, if I can gain popularity and sit at that lunch table, life will be okay. You see it in high school as you start pursuing, if I can just get into this college, or if I can just get going with this career, you begin to think, if I just have a guy, if I just have a girl, if I can just get married. And then married people start looking around and going, if I just didn't have to deal with this, these insane kids, and we're seeking acceptance, we're seeking comfort, we're seeking things from people around us. We're putting the weight of our own identity and our own self-being in relationships. And so, I say, if I could just get married, that would fill the longing in my heart. Or if I just had kids, or if my kids would just behave, it would fill the longing of my heart. If I could just get my kids to do their science homework just once without me complaining, my life would be okay. And we're wired this way because there is a brokenness and an emptiness on the inside of us. And so we start, hearing phrases in relationships where somebody, the guy looks at the girl. He's got this beautiful love song going on in the background. He just looks at her and goes, oh, baby, you complete me. Oh, you complete me. You make me everything that I am. And we hear that. We think that is the goal in relationships. And here's what Paul's saying. Nobody can complete you. Nobody can do that. If you are, as a single person, believing that if you just could find a marriage partner, that your soul would be filled. If I just had that, it would all be okay. Or if you're, as a married person, going, if I just had that guy or that one or somebody who's not this person, my life would be okay. That is a sign that there's something deeply broken and wrong in you. And look at what Paul says. After this argument, after answering these questions, he just says this. Verse 17, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, listen, who you are today for this moment is what the Lord has assigned to you. His sovereignty in you has chosen you, who you are right here today. He has chosen this for you, believer in Jesus. He has called you to this. If you're single right now today, he has chosen you this for you, and he has called you to this. If you're married, like just right now, look at your spouse and go, in this moment, God has chosen this for me. He has called me to this. And Paul says, whatever that state is, walk in that today. Don't always be pursuing something, thinking if I just had something different, something better, something more fulfilling, my life would be okay. Paul is saying, listen, you're looking in the wrong places. And he uses a couple weird examples. I don't have a whole lot of time to unpack this, but he uses these as illustrations. He talks about people who are circumcised or uncircumcised. This is an issue, and you guys can have fun having that conversation, what that means with your kids. I'm not going to give any descriptions or explanations, although it would be fun. But the bottom line is there is in this something culturally where circumcised people would racially be accepted by the Jews, uncircumcised would be by the Greeks. And they're saying, listen, if a Jewish person going, I just wish I could fit in with those people over there who aren't Jewish. And Greek people going, I wish I could just fit in with Jewish people. It's just kind of this sense of doing something that makes you fit in, makes you belong. And Paul says, listen, none of that matters. The only thing that matters is your obedience to the law, trusting in what God has told you to do. And then he uses the illustration of slavery. And this is not slavery like African-American slavery, but it's a slavery that was set in the economics of their day. And people often, when they were broke and hurting financially, they would give their skill and they would sell themselves as a slave to certain people. And about a third of the Roman Empire, a third of the city of Corinth would have been people who were slaves at this point in time. This verse is not speaking to the goodness or badness of slavery, but what Paul is saying, listen, if you think that if you just got out from underneath slavery, your life would be okay, you're missing the point. You got yourself into this mess. Your life wasn't okay. And so if you can get your freedom, that's fine, but here's the real point. In whatever state you find yourself in, walk in that, see it as God's gift to you, God's sovereign purpose for you on this day, and it is the way that God is going to shape you and form you so that you're ready for the resurrection. Formed by the cross, ready for the resurrection, and today, God has that woman, that man, those kids, or for those of you who are single, he has this life for this moment to shape you into the image of Jesus and prepare you for heaven. And as he does this, he just says, listen, so what do we do with that? And Paul just, a couple things, he says, we need to trust in Christ in this. We need to trust in what God has done. This whole passage is saying, listen, walk in this knowing that God is sovereign. Walk in this knowing that God has given this. You're not doing this alone. You can know that right now, this moment, you're not alone, that God is with you. He is for you. Trust in him. He also tells us to walk in obedience. Again, look at verse 19 in this. He says, neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. In other words, here's what he's saying. He's saying, if I begin to long for a different reality, if I think, okay, if I would be happy if I just had this, what I'll begin to do is I'll begin rationalizing that, well, I know God said I'm supposed to live this way. I know God said I'm supposed to act this way. I know God said I'm supposed to do this with my body, but that doesn't make me happy. I'm not happy right now. And so I think God wants me to be happy. Therefore, I'm going to do what I want and ask God to bless it. And Paul's saying, it doesn't work. Obedience is the way you find that joy. And then he talks about surrender. Verse 23, he says, you were bought with a price. This is an echo of what he said over in chapter 6, verse 20, where he says, listen, you were bought with a price, so glorify God with your body. That you are not your own, you are his. And so if you're a follower of Jesus, listen, if you have trusted in Jesus, that's who you are. You are bought with a price, that you are Christ. He loves you enough to have redeemed you and paid with his own blood for your life. You are not your own. And so live as a person who's bought with a price. And surrender yourself to that, knowing that he is good and he is for you. So what does this look like? It means that tomorrow morning I wake up, I'm going to roll over, my wife's going to be there next to me, and my kids are going to be in the house. And I wake up tomorrow morning just going, God, I know that this is what you have for me for this day. And with coronavirus, it is your sovereign purpose right now for us to spend a lot of time together. But I trust you. I'm going to walk in obedience to love these people, to forgive them, to be close to them. And I'm going to be reminded each and every day that I am not my own, that you own me. And therefore, whatever you want from me, that's what I will do. It's if you wake up tomorrow morning and you are a single person, say, listen, I wake up and I may feel lonely. I may feel like this is really hard, but I know that God, I'm not really alone. You are with me and you are for me, and that I'm holding on to you. It's waking up if you are in a hard marital relationship and looking at your spouse and prayerfully going, okay, God, this is what you have for me today. How do I trust you? How do I walk in obedience to what you've commanded me? And how do I keep reminding myself that I am not my own, I am yours, and my fulfillment does not come from him, it does not come from her, it comes from you and you alone. And over in this text, he keeps talking about the fact that we are called. He repeats it multiple times, that we are people who are called. Just let your eyes wander through the text and see it. He uses the word called like 8 or 9 times. And for Paul, this word is very important because he's talking about the day of our salvation. Here's what he's saying. He's saying that there was a day when somebody shared the gospel with you and somebody preached. It may have been a church service. It may have been in a revival. It may have been a friend one-to-one having coffee, but they shared Christ with you. But what happened is in that moment, it wasn't just their voice. There was the voice of God himself who ushered an invitation to you, who invited you to himself, who said, I love you. I am for you. I have sent my son and he has died for you. Forgiveness and hope is all available for you. And the calling voice of God did something to your heart and gripped you. And on that day you went, okay, Christ is died. I give my life to him. I trust him. I give myself away. And you turned to who Jesus was and gave all of you to all that he is. And Christ on that day saved you from death, from hell, the grave, saved you to eternal life, saved you to hope. And he's saying, listen, that by using this word over and over again, he's reminding followers of Jesus that whatever you were in that place, that from that day on, we are his. Now, if you're here today and you're not a follower of Jesus, our hope today is that even this sermon, that the last few minutes we talking about this, that you're hearing this and that the voice of the Holy Spirit will open your heart to believe the gospel. And so for all of us, what we want is single people to find beauty in their lives to fulfill all that God has for them. For married people to live their marriage for the glory of God. But for all of us to see in Christ that he's enough. He's enough. And to place our faith and trust in him. To turn from ourselves to trust him. And so, listen, if this message hit you hard and there's some questions or challenges, please reach out. Form at the bottom of this post. You can fill that out and we can interact with that. This is your first time, or maybe today you are giving your life to Christ. We'd encourage you just even today to pause and fill that form out so we can know that you are here. We're going to continue our worship with prayer, with music, and with an opportunity for you to give. You can give right online in this blog post if you're a part of our church. If you're not, we ask that the service is our gift. We don't really ask you to give. But in all the things that we do here, we just want to magnify and make much of Jesus. And so we're thankful that you're with us today. Let me pray and then we'll move on. Lord, you're good to us. Thank you for my wife and my family. They are your gift to me. And I'm thankful for how they shaped me. And I just pray for other families as they wade through this hard days that you will give them blessing and hope. We love you, Lord, and we praise you. In your name I pray.